set.
There's something about California in 1979 that captures a specific moment when the golden promise of the state began to show its first cracks. The optimism was still there, the innovation continued, the sunshine remained constant. But beneath the surface, tensions were building, costs were rising, and California was beginning to transform into something different from what it had been just a few years earlier. This was the year when the California dream started to shift, when earthquakes reminded people that the ground itself was unstable, when political violence shocked San Francisco, when the technology revolution was quietly accelerating in garages and office parks, when ordinary people were beginning to realize that the affordable, accessible California of the early 1970s was slipping away. Living in California in 1979 meant being at the intersection of incredible opportunity and growing anxiety. The state was still the place where America's future was being invented. Silicon Valley was emerging. Hollywood was thriving. The weather was still perfect. But something was changing. Housing costs were climbing faster. Traffic was getting worse. The easy optimism of the early decade was being replaced by something more complicated. Let's walk through what life actually felt like in California during that pivotal year. Some of this might surprise you. Some of it explains why 1979 became a reference point that economists and historians still use today. This was the year when California was still golden, but the shine was starting to tarnish. Let's step into 1979. The year began like most California years, with sunshine and the sense that anything was possible. But 1979 would prove to be different. This was a year when California would experience shocks that reminded residents that even paradise had its vulnerabilities. The most dramatic moment came on October 15th when the Imperial Valley earthquake struck near the Mexico border. The quake measured significant enough to damage irrigation canals, roads, and buildings across the region. For Californians who had built their lives on land that occasionally shifted beneath them, this was a stark reminder. The infrastructure that made California life possible, the canals that brought water to desert farms, the highways that connected sprawling communities, all of it was more fragile than people like to think about. The Imperial Valley was not Los Angeles or San Francisco, so the national attention was limited. But for those living in Southern California, the earthquake was a reminder that the ground could open up at any moment. California was built on fault lines, literally and figuratively. People accepted this risk because everything else about California made it worth it. The weather, the opportunities, the lifestyle. But earthquakes reminded everyone that California demanded something in return for all it offered. Earlier in the year, San Francisco experienced a different kind of shock. In May, the White Night riots erupted after Dan White received what many considered an outrageously lenient sentence for killing Mayor George Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk. White had walked into City Hall the previous November and shot both men. When he was convicted only of voluntary manslaughter rather than murder and sentenced to just 7 years, the gay community and progressive activists exploded with rage. On the night of May 21st, thousands gathered outside City Hall. What began as a protest turned into a riot. Windows were smashed. Police cars were set on fire. The violence continued for hours. The riots represented something larger than one verdict. They reflected the deep political and cultural divisions running through California. San Francisco had always been the liberal heart of California, the place where counterculture thrived and traditional values were questioned. But the White Night riots showed that even in progressive San Francisco, there were limits to tolerance and deep anger simmering beneath the surface. The riots also highlighted the particular moment California was in. The 1960s idealism was long gone. The casual optimism of the early 1970s was fading. By 1979, California politics had become more polarized, more angry, more divided. The Harvey Milk assassination and the subsequent riots became a symbol of California's transformation from a place of possibility to a place of conflict. For ordinary Californians far from San Francisco politics, life in 1979 continued along familiar patterns. The car culture that defined California remained central to daily existence. People drove everywhere. The freeways were crowded, but not yet the parking lots they would become. You could still drive across Los Angeles in reasonable time, though traffic was noticeably worse than it had been 5 years earlier. The cars themselves reflected the impact of the oil crisis that had hit earlier in the decade. The enormous American sedans and station wagons that had dominated California roads were being joined by smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles. Japanese imports were becoming common. Hondas, Toyotas, and Datsuns were appearing in driveways across California. These cars were practical, reliable, and got better gas mileage than the American behemoths. For Californians who had built their entire lives around driving, fuel efficiency suddenly mattered. But the classic California car culture was not dead. Muscle cars, custom vans, and big American cruisers were still everywhere. The van culture that had exploded in the mid-1970s continued strong. Conversion vans with shag carpeting, custom paint jobs, and elaborate interiors were still the ultimate California vehicle. These vans represented freedom. You could drive up the coast, park at the beach, and live a mobile California lifestyle. The van was more than transportation. It was a way of life. Teenage boys still modified cars, racing on empty roads in the valleys and deserts surrounding Los Angeles. Car culture ran deep in California identity. Even as fuel efficiency became important, the love of driving, of having the perfect car, of cruising, remained fundamental to California life. Inside California homes, the aesthetic of 1979 was pure late 1970s. Earth tones dominated. Brown, orange, and beige were everywhere. Shag carpeting remained popular, though it was past its peak. Wood paneling covered walls in family rooms and basements. Avocado green and harvest gold appliances filled kitchens. The look was warm, casual, and distinctly of its moment. Televisions were the center of family entertainment. Most families had one TV, maybe two if they were doing well. The evening was structured around television programming. Families gathered to watch shows together. There was no streaming, no cable for most people yet, just the major networks and maybe a few local channels. Television was a shared experience. Everyone watched the same shows, talked about the same programs at work and school. The music playing in California homes in 1979 reflected a moment of transition. Disco was still dominant, but beginning its decline. Rock was evolving. Punk was emerging from the underground. New wave was just arriving. California bands continued to define popular music. Fleetwood Mac was at their peak. The Eagles remained huge. Linda Ronstadt, Jackson Browne, and the rest of the California sound still dominated the airwaves. But new sounds were emerging. In Los Angeles, punk rock was thriving in small clubs. Bands were playing aggressive, raw music that rejected the polished production of mainstream California rock. The punk scene was small, mostly ignored by the mainstream, but it represented a new California sensibility. Angry, cynical, rejecting the laid-back optimism that had defined California culture. The economy in California in 1979 was complicated. On the surface, California was booming. The state was an economic powerhouse. Agriculture in the Central Valley was massive. Oil production was significant. Tourism brought millions of visitors. Hollywood remained the center of American entertainment. Aerospace employed tens of thousands in good-paying jobs, and Silicon Valley was beginning its transformation into the technology capital of the world. But beneath the surface, problems were emerging. Research conducted years later using 1979 as a baseline would show that this was the year when the economic trajectory for ordinary workers began to change. Real wages for low-wage workers stopped growing. The gap between the wealthy and working class began to widen. Housing costs were rising faster than incomes. The California dream, the idea that anyone could move to California and build a good middle-class life, was becoming harder to achieve. In 1979, this was not yet obvious to most people. California still felt like the land of opportunity. Jobs were available. The economy seemed strong. But the seeds of the inequality and housing crisis that would define California in later decades were already being planted. Silicon Valley in 1979 was on the verge of explosion. The personal computer revolution was about to go mainstream. Apple Computer was growing rapidly. The Apple II, released 2 years earlier, was proving that regular people wanted computers in their homes. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak had gone from working in a garage to running a real company. They were getting rich, and people were starting to notice. Other technology companies were proliferating across the peninsula. Engineers were moving to California from across the country, drawn by the opportunities in technology. The culture in Silicon Valley was unique. It mixed counterculture attitudes with engineering precision and business ambition. Engineers would meet at bars after work, competitors would share ideas, and a sense of collective mission pervaded the tech community. Everyone believed they were building the future. Intel was developing microprocessors that would power the coming computer revolution. Atari was still thriving, though it would soon face challenges. Xerox PARC was inventing technologies that would not be commercialized for years but would eventually transform computing. The technology industry was still small compared to what it would become, but by 1979, the outlines of the future were visible. For ordinary people working in Silicon Valley, this meant good jobs and growing opportunities. Engineers were paid well. The work was interesting and challenging. There was a sense of being part of something important. But Silicon Valley was not yet the wealthy enclave it would become. Housing was expensive compared to other parts of the country, but still affordable for middle-class workers. You could buy a house on an engineer's salary. That would not remain true for long. Southern California's economy was dominated by different industries. Aerospace remained massive. Companies like Lockheed and McDonnell Douglas employed tens of thousands. These were stable, well-paying jobs that had drawn people to California for decades. The defense industry was central to Southern California's prosperity. The Cold War meant steady contracts and steady work. Hollywood continued to define Los Angeles. The film and television industry employed thousands directly and many more in supporting businesses. Working in the industry was still a common aspiration for people moving to Los Angeles. The dream of making it in Hollywood remained powerful, even though most people who chased that dream never achieved it. The tourism industry was booming. Disneyland attracted millions of visitors every year. The beaches drew people from across the country and around the world. California had successfully marketed itself as a destination, a place where the weather was always perfect and the lifestyle was enviable. But the cost of this success was becoming apparent. The population was growing rapidly. More people meant more traffic, more pollution, more strain on infrastructure. Los Angeles in 1979 was noticeably more crowded than it had been a decade earlier. The freeway system that had seemed so modern and efficient was beginning to struggle under the weight of millions of daily commuters. Air quality remained a serious problem. Smog hung over Los Angeles on many days. The brown haze was visible and everyone could feel it in their lungs. California had implemented stricter environmental regulations than other states, but the problem persisted. Too many cars, too many factories, too many people packed into valleys surrounded by mountains that trapped the pollution. The beach culture that defined coastal California continued to evolve in 1979. Surfing remained central to the identity of beach communities. Towns like Huntington Beach, Venice, Santa Monica, and Malibu each maintained their distinct characters. The surfing lifestyle was not just about riding waves. It was a complete culture with its own fashion, music, and values. Skateboarding had exploded in the mid-1970s and remained huge in 1979. The Z-Boys had revolutionized skateboarding, turning it from a kid's pastime into an athletic and artistic pursuit. Empty swimming pools became skate parks during California's droughts. Teenagers would scope out houses with empty pools, hop fences, and skate until the police showed up or the owners came home. This guerrilla approach to skateboarding defined the culture. Venice Beach in 1979 was becoming the eccentric, chaotic place it would be famous for. Muscle Beach attracted bodybuilders from around the world. Arnold Schwarzenegger had made Muscle Beach famous, and by 1979, bodybuilding was transitioning from a subculture to a mainstream fitness trend. Street performers, artists, and counterculture types filled the boardwalk. Venice was weird, creative, and sometimes dangerous. It was California at its most diverse and unpredictable. Food culture in California was continuing to change in 1979. Alice Waters' Chez Panisse in Berkeley had been open for 8 years and was influencing how Californians thought about food. The farm-to-table movement was spreading slowly. The idea that food should be fresh, seasonal, and locally sourced was revolutionary in an America dominated by processed foods and chain restaurants. Health food consciousness was more advanced in California than the rest of the country. Juice bars, vegetarian restaurants, and natural food stores were common in California cities. This was partly a continuation of 1960s counterculture values and partly a response to increasing awareness of nutrition and health. Californians were more likely to care about what they ate, more likely to experiment with vegetarian or health-conscious diets. Mexican food was everywhere and completely integrated into California cuisine. Tacos, burritos, and enchiladas were everyday food, not exotic or special. California's proximity to Mexico and large Mexican-American population meant authentic Mexican food was widely available. The Mission District in San Francisco and neighborhoods throughout Los Angeles served Mexican food that had nothing to do with the Americanized versions found in other parts of the country. Fast food chains continued to expand across California. McDonald's, Burger King, and Taco Bell were everywhere. In-N-Out Burger was expanding across Southern California and developing the cult following it maintains today. The burgers were simple, fresh, and consistent. In-N-Out represented a California approach to fast food, and people were passionate about it in a way that seemed ridiculous to outsiders but made perfect sense to Californians. For teenagers in California in 1979, life centered on school, friends, music, and cars. High school was the social universe. Friday night football games, parties, cruising in cars, hanging out at the beach or the mall. The mall had become the center of teenage social life. Malls were more than shopping. They were where you went to see people, to be seen, to kill time. Drive-in movies were still popular in 1979, though they were beginning their decline. Taking a date to the drive-in was a classic California experience. The actual movie was often secondary to the social experience. Drive-ins represented freedom and privacy in a way that indoor theaters did not. Music was central to teenage identity. What music you listened to defined who you were. Rock fans were different from disco fans who were different from punk fans. By 1979, disco was becoming uncool, at least among certain groups. Rock purists hated disco. The punk scene rejected it completely, but disco was still playing in clubs and on the radio, still dominating pop culture even as the backlash was building. Radio was how most people discovered music. There was no internet, no streaming, no easy way to find new music except by listening to the radio or buying albums based on what friends recommended. DJs had real power to break new songs and artists. FM radio in California played album rock, deep cuts alongside hits, and gave listeners access to music they would never hear on AM radio. For young people thinking about their futures, California in 1979 still represented possibility. This was still the place to reinvent yourself, to start over, to chase dreams. People moved to California with vague plans and high hopes. Many failed. Many ended up working regular jobs, living regular lives, but the dream remained powerful. California was where you went to become someone different. However, the economic reality was becoming more challenging. Entry-level jobs paid less in real terms than they had earlier in the decade. Housing costs were rising rapidly, especially in desirable areas. A young person moving to California in 1979 would find opportunities, but they would also find competition, high costs, and the realization that the easy California life they imagined was harder to achieve than previous generations had found it. The political climate in California in 1979 reflected national trends but with California characteristics. The conservative backlash that had begun in the mid-1970s was growing stronger. Proposition 13, passed the previous year, had slashed property taxes and reflected growing taxpayer anger about the cost of government. This would have profound effects on California's ability to fund schools and infrastructure in the coming decades. California was politically divided in ways that foreshadowed later polarization. The coast was liberal, the inland areas more conservative. Urban areas leaned left, rural areas right. Wealthy suburbanites often held different political views than working-class communities. The coalition that had built California's generous public services and infrastructure was fracturing. The environmental movement remained strong in California. Californians cared about air quality, water quality, and preserving natural spaces. But this environmentalism coexisted with massive freeways, suburban sprawl, and a car-dependent lifestyle. The contradictions were obvious but rarely addressed directly. One of the lesser-known facts about 1979 is how it became a baseline year for economists studying wage stagnation and income inequality. Researchers analyzing economic trends discovered that 1979 was the year when real wages for ordinary workers stopped growing with productivity. The connection between working harder and earning more, which had been fundamental to the American dream, began to weaken in 1979. For most Californians living through the year, this was not obvious. The economy seemed fine. Unemployment was manageable. Inflation was a concern, but it had been a concern for years. The realization that something fundamental had shifted would only come later. When looking back at the data, this economic shift was particularly significant in California because California had always represented upward mobility. The California dream was not just about sunshine and beaches. It was about the ability to build a better life, to own a home, to provide for your family. In 1979, that dream was still achievable for many, but it was becoming harder. The gap between wealthy and working class was widening. The path to middle-class security was getting steeper. Wildfires were a recurring problem in California in 1979, as they had been for years and would continue to be. The dry California climate, the Santa Ana winds, and the increasing number of homes built in fire-prone areas created conditions for devastating fires. Local histories document multiple significant fires during this period. Fires would sweep through canyons and hillsides, destroying homes and forcing evacuations. Californians accepted fire risk much like they accepted earthquake risk. It was part of the bargain. You got to live in California with all its advantages, and in return you accepted certain dangers. Most years, most people were fine, but every year, some people lost everything. The media landscape in California in 1979 was centered on newspapers and television. The Los Angeles Times was a major institution, one of the great American newspapers. Everyone read the Times, or at least everyone claimed to. It was how people understood their city and state. Television news was how most people learned about the world. The evening news was an appointment. Walter Cronkite or one of the other network anchors delivered the news. And that was what America knew about the world. California had always been obsessed with itself, constantly examining and celebrating and critiquing its own identity. Books and articles about California, about the California dream, about what California meant, appeared constantly. California was not just a place. It was an idea, a promise, a state of mind. This self-consciousness was part of California's identity. By the end of 1979, California remained the most dynamic state in America. The population was still growing. The economy was still generating opportunity. Silicon Valley was on the verge of transforming the world. Hollywood continued to produce the entertainment that defined American culture. The beaches and mountains and deserts offered a natural beauty that few places could match. But the cracks were showing. The easy optimism of the early 1970s was gone. The political consensus that had built California's infrastructure and services was breaking down. The cost of living was rising faster than wages. Traffic was getting worse. The dream was still there, but it was becoming more expensive to chase. For those who lived in California in 1979, it felt like a pivotal year even if they could not articulate exactly why. Something was changing. The future still looked bright, but it looked more complicated than it had before. California was still golden, but the gold was tarnished by smog, by traffic, by rising costs, by political division, by the realization that paradise demanded a price that kept increasing. The year 1979 sits at an interesting point in California history. It was after the easy, abundant California of the 1960s and early 1970s. It was before the extreme wealth and inequality and tech domination of later decades. It was a moment of transition, when the old California was fading and the new California was not yet fully formed. For people with memories of California in 1979, it represents a specific moment, a time when California was still affordable enough for ordinary people to build lives there, when Silicon Valley was exciting but not yet the center of global wealth and power, when Hollywood was still glamorous, when the beaches were less crowded, when the traffic was bad but not impossible, when California still felt like it might deliver on its promises. The earthquakes reminded people that California was built on unstable ground. The riots showed that the political tensions were real and sometimes violent. The economic data, analyzed later, revealed that the California dream was already starting to slip away from many people. But in the moment, in 1979, California was still California. Still the place where the future was being invented. Still the Golden State. If you found this look back at California in 1979 fascinating, consider subscribing to explore more stories about how Americans really lived through the decades that shaped our world today. There are so many more moments, places, and years worth revisiting. And drop a comment below sharing your own memories of California in the late 1970s, or let me know what year or place you would like to see explored next. What do you remember most about this era? What surprises you looking back? Let's keep the conversation going.